what is the purpose of it. So breath is the first thing. The moment you're born, you take in the breath, and the moment you die, you let out the breath. What goes between them is a rhythmic pattern through which life sustains. Now, most of the times when you have any kind of a disorder, or you have any kind of a thing which is hurting your stability, you get angry, you get sad, you get where you're not yourself. When things start ceasing for you, you're just engrossed in something where nothing works, your breath changes. In disease, your breath changes. When you've got fever, your breath will be very shallow. When you're dying, it will be more shallow. You're a child, your breath will be very fast. It's said that in a lot of we spend most of our breaths in the first 5 years. You see in animals, the animals who are very active, tiger, dog, they have very fast breath. Animals who live long, they have very slow breath. Now the concept starts here that we learn from nature. So it's so started that if we can voluntarily control this breath, voluntarily understand what is happening when and where, we can elongate our bodies. Why do we want to elongate our bodies? So that we get that much more time to reach that super consciousness in whatever school of thought you're going from. So here the concept of breath comes. Now, a lot of time people equate breath with pran. No, pran is not breath. Pran is this vitality which is circulated by breath. Like I'm talking with you now. So if I just die in 1 second, the breath will be still there within me. Some kind of breath will be there. But what has stopped circulating? Inside, outside. That what is lost is called pran. So when that pran, the first time you take the breath inside, independent, is the pran, the vayu which take inside is called as pran vayu. The moment it goes out, the vayu which throws it out is either apan vayu or udan vayu, depending upon if you are a mistake, it will go out from here. Rest it will go out from anywhere. So if it goes out from here, then it is said that it is a perfect let out of pran, where you're transmigrating, you're voluntarily breaking up the shell so that it doesn't again go back into some other unit. You have done it. So that is the basis of any yogic practices. You go in samadhi, you go in hatha yogic practices, or any sampradaya. So that depends upon the school of thought. Now, how can we get a complete control of this breath? How exactly we do complete control of this breath? Why it is required? Is it only that if I control the breath, everything is fine? No. So there requires a discipline of diet, of lifestyle, which comes in yam and niyam. In certain schools of tantra, yam and niyam is not there. Only 6 from pranayam it starts. Someone people put japa in it. But the yam and niyam is already incorporated by the kind of nyasas, the kind of sadhanas you do. Dietary requirement is not an adjuvant. A lot of the time people say, okay, I'm doing yogic practices, I also want diet. Diet is not an adjuvant, it is a requirement, because you have to create that stability in your body, that when you're breathing properly, you're not getting that burping, you're not getting that flatulence. Sometimes people do, I want to do breathing only in Brahma Muhurat, getting up in the morning. That is also not required. The whole concept is whether your awareness of the stillness of the breath, when you can voluntarily control it. The various methods of pranayam, 320 types of pranayam, or 320 different types of pranayam. Some people then percolate into Plavini, Ujjayi breath, Brahmari pranayam, Kapalbhati pranayam, Surya Nadi pranayam, Chandra Nadi pranayam, alternate Nadi Shuddhi. These are all methodologies to propagate your practices. So if I'm staying in a very geographical environment which is very cold, I'll use Kapalbhati first to warm up my body. If I want to absorb the heat within me, I don't want to increase the heat, but I want to absorb the heat, I want to absorb the part, then I'll do Dirgha Shvasan with Jalandhar Bandh, Mool Bandh. So this is our practices of how exactly I'm creating stability into my body. And this is where the concept of breath comes in the practitioner's world, and how exactly it has percolated down, because a lot of time we read from text. A lot of time we read from Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Hatha Ratnavali, some Nat Yoga traditions. So we just do the text, we translate it, and we try to focus on the practices. And we feel if I can do this practice well, if I can sit in that asana properly, then what will happen? I'll get some kind of a thing. And because, when you do breathing, you get this sense, a concept that I'm doing something out of the body. And there lies the problem. So your breath, as it said, must be still. You have only that much prana into your system every day, like 21,600 prana, depending on which text you follow. All the derivative is sum total of the same. Some will say 21,600, some will say 13,800, some will say something else. It doesn't matter who says what. Depending on which school of thought you are following and how much of the pran you are retaining inside each pran, how much are you expending, and what is your deficit. The more quickly you cut off the deficit, your pran becomes still into your system. The more it becomes still into your system, the udana takes it up. And this is the concepts in various schools, which are found either separately as a text and as practices. So those who practice like this, I have been practicing over a period of time in the Himalayas. So these differences were very apparent to me because I was practicing. But before that, when I was, referring certain books or somebody told me, they don't become very apparent to you. So even if we can do this Ajab Gayatri or somebody says Soham, we observe it, we can control it properly with proper diet, even that will give you benefit. But if some kind of a breaths are there which you have been practicing over a period of time and those are not helping you, then the quotient here is that are they helping you? Because if that pran is not, even if you're doing a pranayam breathing which you feel is great, but is exhausting more prana than retaining, you're still going towards that. So this concept has to be understood, that technique versus application, and that can only come when it is methodically taken. So people do yoga with a lot of asana and all. Okay, that is also damaging, but it is still fine. But if you combine breath with it in a wrong way, then it is going to accelerate degeneration in your system. If you do it with proper isolation, it will be fine. Certain breaths like Ajab Gayatri, you're doing some breathing, like, when somebody does an asana, Bhujangasana, he goes up, he inhale, when he goes down, he exhales, that is fine. The moment you get into bandhas, the moment you go into locking the system, the moment you go into different parts, it will cause problem because it is causing a negative feedback. You're putting some pressure, you're putting some tension in some strutas, in some organs, in some cellular level. It can burst, it can retain, it can go, like you're holding urine for a long period of time. If you don't evacuate, eventually you won't get urine, you'll require catheterization to take it out. It happens, it leads to prolapse. So breath is same. The point between pressure, the exact retention and when it is causing collapse should be known. And if you go through all pranayam practices around the world, it is about retaining the breath either inside or outside for a particular period of time. If that is not done with proper posture, if that is not supported with proper diet, proper lifestyle, understanding of your geographical condition, then in the long run, it can cause you more trouble.
So would you say that what you were just sharing, that, when a lot of people do pranayama, they feel wonderful, right? That's the short-term effect, but in the process, like you said, it could be causing degeneration. But nothing is getting sustained. Like, because here we're looking, the point of it is stability and sustenance of energy, right? And so how is somebody, even yoga teachers themselves or yoga students, can discern between if your one's practice is actually degenerative or it's actually focused on sustaining?
See, it comes from being a little bit honest with oneself. I'll talk for myself, is that I know a lot of techniques and I know a lot of techniques. So am I showing these techniques because I can do it properly? Let us say I do a lot of techniques every day and I can execute it much better than hundreds of people. But I should be honest with myself whether it is helping me or not. Is it adding to my stability? I might have acidity, I might have heart issues, I might have obesity. I'm not talking people who are fat or not. Fat and obesity are two different things. You're not able to sit properly. You have just eaten food, but you have a yoga class. So you have eaten light, you're going. Your practice is going to be this. Even if I tell you, right, if I'm coming in this lecture and I've read a message which is causing me irritation, I'm saying that, okay, I want to respond to this message as soon as the lecture gets over. And if I teach you breath, even that will cause me problem. That much importance is when you do specialized breath. Specialized breath requires you complete stillness to know what exactly you want to be into. Which kind, that can only come if you have a good teacher, if you have understood your philosophy well. Because I said there are a lot of traditions, tantric traditions, there are a lot of cults, Nath cult, Ajivikas, everybody uses some form of breath. Even if you go to some spiritual gurus nowadays, it could be Sri Ravi Shankar of, what to do of Surya Kriya, I don't know what, and I'm not recollecting it. You Sudarshan Kriya. If you go to Sadhguruji, there will be something else. If you go to someone else, there will be every Swamiji which you go will teach you some kind of a breath, some kind of a pranayam, which will be a little bit different from something. But is it helping you because you're doing just that pranayam, or you're doing the entire yam niyam along with it? You're following that complete path with total surrender. So till yoga teachers or whomsoever are doing, if they understand their stability, if they follow in their class schedule, their eating times, sleeping times, they do not correlate with certain concepts. If you are doing the Vedic concepts like supplements, veganism, they just go core with the concepts of 5L. Whatever I eat, is it giving me stability? If I eat something, is it causing me some acid problems, flatulence? And that's how when they start discerning, their breath will start increasing. Why? Because again, I said, it is not about the practice. It is again about how much prana you are retaining into your body and the minimal you are spending for maximum gain. And when that starts happening, only then the stability comes. Now, these concepts of pranayam, apan vayu, udan vayu, they get conglomerated. First, people used to learn yoga. I get a lot of students who come to talk with me. So first they used to learn yoga. Then somebody told me to tell them learn Ayurveda. So in Ayurveda, the concepts are different. So they'll try to mix match. Then somebody told me that, there is some asana for Prithvi, there is some asana for water, there is some asana for air. So this mix matching, when it starts happening, we are thinking, I'm not saying new student who comes, he feels, no, I need to learn something exclusive. I need to learn something hundreds of techniques. And the whole concept becomes problem. As I was telling in the last lecture, this Shat Karma. Earlier, yogis used to do this Shat Karma. When let's say, one of my colleagues went into a yogic life. So he did the Shat Karma. So he did this Nauti, Dhauli, whatever. Once he perfected it, he did not even touch the food which he was eating. Why? Because he said, now my body is purificatory measure. Now I'm not allowed to eat anything to recreate that toxin. So I will purify my body. Now I'm going on my yogic path. Now what we are doing, we are learning Nauli, Dhoti properly. But what we are doing, the moment we eat something, pizza and all, the next day we'll take something, we'll try to throw it off. That will pull it more inside. So just because a technique is known, it doesn't mean that it is helping you. It might make you feel good, but eventually it is a mind thing. Physiologically, your heart rate, you might be in control. You might say, no, with my breath, I can increase my heart rate, decrease my heart rate. But why is it required? Let us say I can decrease my heart rate till 10. Is it required in a hot condition? No. It is required when I'm in a cave, I'm in hibernation, I don't have food. I can decrease it down. So, less prana is being, which the yogis do when they go in the Himalayas get cut off for 6 months, there are no roads. It is a geographical requirement. But by your practice, involuntarily, if that is happening, then eventually what is going to happen? You are going to suffer less volume to your kidneys when it is required. The moment you get up, your body is not able to balance your blood pressure. You start getting lightheadedness. Aneurysm is something where the artery prolapses inside. You'll start getting pooling of blood. I've seen this. I'm telling you, in just from yogic practices and my clinical practice, and what kind of clients come to me. So to just correct those practices and no medicines are required. But if they come to me and they tell me that, no, doctor, everything is fine. I'm doing pranayama. So we say pranayama is like, you're doing pranayama means you're doing something healthy. The concept of health doesn't depend upon your concept of food and practice. It is a very algorithmic thing. And that everybody, whenever they meddle with Ayurvedic, yogic sciences together, should slowly start understanding. Today, we are given this on a platter, with comparative things. Okay, Ayurveda says that don't eat oily, don't eat this. So we say, no, less sugar, less salt. We are comparing modern nutrition with Ayurvedic facets. Similarly, what is happening? You are comparing the concepts of compassion, sattva with pranayama. So the moment you feel you're eating a fruit diet, you're doing meditation, you're doing asana, you feel I'm doing something healthy. Then somebody say, then why do you have a disease? Then they'll say, no, it might be a karmic dosh. So you'll go into Jyotish. This chain never ends. So once you start applying by unlearning these concepts, that whatever food I'm eating, whatever food I'm getting in my life, I'm, very grateful for it. Can I create a system so that it doesn't create any toxin? Once you start working towards it, the same food, you'll understand what to throw out, what to not. With your breathing, your digestion will improve, your excretion will improve. And eventually it will become an involuntary process because you don't have to work for it. And your breath stabilizes. In our practice also, or whatever the treatments I give, we have given, what we do, we stabilize the breath. In 15 days, we put people on the same diet. They like it or they do not like it. Why? Because the breath becomes stabilized. The moment you start eating something, your breath goes here and there, you'll start getting problems. And this is the reason what Vedic sciences, yogic sciences meant. But because people come from different zones, everybody's not looking for emancipation. Everybody's not looking for an out-of-body experience. So you customize certain things for their benefit. As you go into the Kali Yuga in today's day, there is no difference between day and night. Some people's work starts at night. Some people's work starts at day. Some people do not eat throughout the day. A lot of people stay in curtailed environments like AC, heaters. A lot of yoga studios use ACs and heaters to perform yoga practices. A lot of people do gymming in AC environments. Because you're doing exercise, but because it is AC, the vata is already there into your bones, you're going to crack your tendons. There is no lubrication happening from inside. Then you'll go and do sweating, like what you call sweat rooms, steaming, you do it. And see, these concepts in today's era, we have to understand to adapt. Staying amidst pollution, staying amidst chaos, can you adapt? And if you just focus on proper breath, you can do it. But it is a very simple thing to say, but very difficult thing to practice.
Thank you. Folks have thoughts and questions and want to just riff off of what Dr. Sumit just shared. Just unmute yourself. If you have anything private or for whatever reason you don't want to share publicly, just private message it to me and I can voice it on the call.
Hi, doctor. This is Pooja. I wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned stability. You mentioned stability a lot of times. Can you explain it to me? Because I'm not exactly able to understand what you mean by stability.
Okay. See, for me, stability doesn't mean a mental thing that I am calm. Stability means that are you unruffled by whatever is going around you? Let us say you're working. A boss comes and shouts on you. Are you unruffled by it? Is your breath? Because the moment that somebody shouts at you in a big environment, you're going to feel that crappy feeling, that everybody's looking at you. You feel angry. You can't do anything. What is happening? Just observe to your breath. Your breath will become up and down. Your heartbeat will increase. Anxiety will happen. You will feel. So that's stability. That moment you're in anywhere, whatever happening, you're stable. Nothing is affecting you. It is a very practical thing. A lot of people make it a very philosophical thing. And yogic practices are not about philosophy. They are about applications. Hatha Yoga is application. Hatha Yoga is not Patanjali Yoga when you're going into a philosophy. That also is an application part. But this stability is something where you can understand it in small things. If you're going home and somebody tells you to do a work which you feel, why should I do it? Others can't do it. You're doing the work, but yet you're feeling very angry about it. You forget about it. It is going to build till a time you will feel that no anybody can take advantage of you. Now, if you apply this concept in each and every existential terms in your life, irrespective of what your moral social conundrums are, you could be someone's wife, mother, doesn't matter. As a human, because see, yogic practices is for the self. When you're dying alone. When you're staying alone. The first breath what you take is in your independent body. You're not taking it with anyone else. The last breath what you'll throw will be through your independent body. Whatever the experiences you're going to get is through your independent body. However you develop, your experiences change. The kind of education you took landed you in a particular job. But did you take that education out of your stability or because the parents forced you? Or somebody told you that, no, you do this, this has got a good future. You are from India, so you'll understand what I'm trying to say. So that stability in each and every moment of your life where nothing is afflicting you, but also that responsibility that if something is affecting you, to take that with humility and try to learn. So it is an ongoing process, and breath helps you stabilize it. Yogis, what they do, they have their goal fixed. So they cut off the stimulus. After a period of time, they give up their home. They first get control over food. Then they'll go to a recluse. Once they see that the kind of food doesn't matter to me, they'll go higher up into the forest. So they can survive on whatever is available. Now, what is happening here? They are not getting up and saying, oh, 5 days I want Starbucks. They are okay. They are getting hungry. They know that in that hunger, whatever is available, they will digest. Why? Because it is not fettering their mind. It is not telling them in the night or tomorrow where my food is going to come from. Then they go a little bit higher up. I'm talking about Himalayas, the way I have learned. So they go a little bit higher up. Then there is geographically your challenge. Sometimes you can be in a cave for 4 months and you won't even get food. So can I get from breath my energy from the sun? Can I just drink water from the moisture around me? There are specialized techniques for it. And eventually a time comes when nothing bothers you. Only you are manifested, nothing is manifesting around you. You can call that a stage of pre-samadhi, dhyan, dharana, whatever you want. So see, all practices of Ashtanga Yoga, Hatha Yoga are not different. So one is a way to get there in a particular way. One is a way to get there in a particular way. The techniques employed are just fast tracking your system. And that is what I mean by stability. Like even if I am here in US right now, so if I keep thinking, okay, when I'll go back to Mumbai, with that thought process, can I teach you breath? No, because internally I am instabilized. Or let us say I had a very heavy meal which is causing me acidity. So even if I'm talking with you, I'm getting that burp. Will I be able to teach you breath? Because in that burp, if I teach you some breath, that is going to go somewhere and going to cause me problem my entire day. So I'll say, no, I've eaten something. I should not be teaching you breath. So even if I have to take this lecture today, I have to keep my diet for 3 days so that I can teach you with stability. Why? It is not for you. It is for my inner way that nothing is fluttering. But it is a very, it is a very ongoing process. But slowly you cut through it. Slowly you cut through your associations, your relationships, your boss, your job, and you start getting that stability that you can survive in any condition. Nothing is going to ruffle you. You're not dependent on anyone. You're not creating also dependencies on someone, but you're not. You're ready to let go and let take anything. And the breath is all about it, because only and only you will see then your breath will be in ayam. You don't have to do a specific thing to do the practice. A lot of people, when they are stressed in the morning, they'll go and do deep meditation. They'll feel good. Again, they come out, the stress comes back again. Again, they'll go, again, they'll do. So this will give you benefit for the 2 hours, 3 hours. But here you are looking for 24/7 stability, even in your sleep. When you're sleeping, you're turning, you're not getting sleep properly, your breath is not proper. Something has happened which is ruffling your breath. So you'll get up and say, no, it's just like I didn't have good sleep. Nothing, your breath was not proper. Why? Because it did not go to that level where you can enter the 3 stages of sleep. So see, everything which is written is elaborated in different texts because there is a lot of time between when it was written and what has been passed down. But the concept remains the same.
Thank you.
If we do any practice like Anulom Vilom or any practice, and we feel good at that time, but how to know is it benefiting us in long term or not? Like, what are the practical signs which will help me or anyone to know that?
See, if I do Anulom Vilom or whatever kind of a deep breathing meditation, okay, apart from Kapalbhati or whatever, you will feel good because what is happening, your brain is going high or going low. So you are entering to a stage where you feel relaxed. So that technique is good. Okay, you're with that technique, you're able to get into that point from whomsoever you have learned, however you have learned. So I never, question on anyone's technique. Everybody is a good teacher. No one is a bad teacher. But the responsibility lies in you. So you felt good in the morning, you said fine. After that, you're going out to your real world. Is that effect where you felt fine replicating in it? If you're getting stressed up, what you're doing, you're again looking for that practice. Then eventually what happens, a vairagya get into your body that I don't want the world. This is how I want to be. That is not a right way to go. You have to create the stability in your work. Why did the first time you started picking up the practice? So there are a lot of people, whom we say, oh, you should do pranayam, you will feel good. They say, no, I don't care. I'm happy in my life. You must have seen a lot of people, they say, what are you doing? I'm happy in my life, drinking, eating.
Yes.
Suddenly someday some stress comes. You tell them at that time, okay, now you try it out. They try it out, they feel good. Now, why have they felt good? Not because of the practice, right? Because they had a reason to feel good. They wanted an escape. Okay, no, I want to feel good. But if that stimulus was not there, would they have taken up the practice? They wouldn't have. Maybe some by accident they might have taken up, but they wouldn't have given much thought to it. Like you see, some people after stress, they go into an yoga ashram for 15 days, what they call as cleanse. You know, there are a lot of ashrams in India where you can pay money for expensive money and you can stay there. Then they teach you yoga, ashtanga. They feel good. They feel rejuvenated. But again, when they come back, what happens? The stability is lost. They are thinking in once year, I'll go spend some money, I'll get my stability in 15 days. But that stability, what you have created, again, if you start putting that inconsistency, the structure of your nadis, the structure is changing. From elastic, it is turning plastic. So what is the use? So once you get into a practice, and if it's very easy for you to replicate it, I think you should start implementing it by cutting the chaos around. This could take some difficult decisions in diet. You should say, I feel good. But why should I have the stimulus to do the practice? If I'm stressed, I'm doing a practice. That is fine for a start. But each time, because I have stress, I have a practice. I'm not doing anything about my stress. Is it a good option? Practice must something which should come natural to you. There should not be a cost to do a practice. Practice should become homogeneous. Like how you do some people who worship the deity. They do not look for a cause to do a deity. They do it anytime. Sometimes when that practice becomes their homogeneous, we'll see every time they are sitting, they are doing Ram, 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 Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. You see that, right? A lot of people do it. They don't require a reason to do it. The practice becomes their life. And breath practice is like that. So you don't have to do Anulom Vilom. Even if you are aware of your breath. The Soham practice, what I said. No, you know. So the moment you are aware of your breath, even if you concentrate on your breath, you will know that when you are getting angry, what is happening. If that time you turn internal and you say, okay, he's making me angry, but let me try to stabilize my breath. You will see the anger will go. These small things everybody should try. It is very easy to try, right? It is a lot of stimulus. You're feeling very hungry, you're craving for something. You'll see your breath change. You'll start getting cranky for it. If you just do it 2-3 days, that craving will go. So once you start experimenting, then you start understanding the deepness of breath. Then you will start doing a diet and a lifestyle to support that breath. And once you understand that stillness for a period of 2 months, 3 months, you won't let it go. Then anything that you put into your system and disturbs the stillness, you will be able to take over, but you will not be in your zone. Because what happens when you have access to brilliance, you do not compromise on derivative forms. You want to always be there. And that is where this breath practice is so important, because it gives you a voluntary control over divinity. Earlier times you had to go to some master, to some priest to access divinity. Why yoga practice? Because it is beyond divinity. You worship anyone, you do anything. You can do it in the confines of your home. The swadhyaya happens within you. You don't have to oblate to anyone. You don't have to do yagyas, pujas, anything. It is your own practice. It is your own havan. It is your own yagya which you are doing. And for yagya, you have to put ghee in terms of what you say, awareness, because you have to burn it. And so this, iconography tells you a lot of application things if we just look beyond the lines.
Okay, thank you. I will try to experiment. To observe. Thank you.
It's all about experiment. Yeah.
Svetlana, did you want to voice your question?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question was, let's say if I don't have a guru and my knowledge on pranayama is only from book, different type of videos, is it a good way to start pranayama, or just don't do it at all and wait until a good teacher come along?
See, this is a good question. And a lot of people ask me. See, first of all, you can't find a guru. Why you can't find a guru? It is not because there are not good gurus, because you are not preparing yourself to understand it in the way. See, like now what I'm telling something. If people have constricted mindsets, I won't use the word constricted, but have definitive mindsets. Okay, he's telling me something, but it is not written in my book, the thing I'm studying. Then you're either going to reject it or you're going to pass on through it. Then you're not getting the teaching. No person is capable enough to teach anything, because if the knowledge is there within someone, it will present to you in a way you are accepting. Like if you think I have got a lot of knowledge and 10 people ask me the questions, they are going to get the answer in the way they are approaching. Not the thing which I told the gentleman before I talked with you. All people might take it in a different way. So in that context, you will find someone to teach as long as you are willing to learn. and you have to let go of your concepts, because we all start from books, we all start from some places. So we have to understand that books, translations, all these things are there to introduce you to a subject. They do not tell you applicative things. Things which I'm telling you might not find in books, because I have not learned from books. So I have learned from my own applications and learning. So I cannot put it in books. Now, it's the same thing if I write it in books. Nobody will understand stability, because some lady asked me, what do you mean by stability? If in my book I just read, no, because of pranayam, you'll get this inner stability where nothing is manifesting around you, everything is manifesting within you. It looks like a good line, but no one will understand what it means. You will think, if I do this, I'll get stability. So pranayam practices are good practices to understand and do it for a period of time if they are aligning with you. There are many practices. As I said, the easiest practice is to just observe your breath, go deep breathing, something which I can show after some time what it is. Even if you do that, then you'll understand that, okay, I'm feeling good, but I'm feeling bloated. Then you'll alter your diet. Then you'll search for a diet which supports your practice. Now, are you willing to do that diet? If somebody tells you you have to leave everything, you say, no, I can't leave this. Then that pranayam practice is of no use. So somebody, okay, you're ready to do a diet, but somebody tells you have to get up at a particular time, eat at a particular time. Are you ready to do it? Only when all these factors become non-existent for you, then only you will find a guru, because there is you're not holding on to any kind of, things. It doesn't matter if your guru tells you get up at 5, get up at 4 in the night, 5 days just go on milk, do this practice, because you're so stabilized into the practice that the external factors are not disturbing you. But now just consider this thing. We read a lot of books, we read a lot of teachers, but we only select those who agree with our comfort. So you have a class, but you have only time in the evening. You'll only go and practice where there is time in the evening. This I'm not saying from an economic point of view. I'm taking from an awareness point of view. It is not that if you go in the evening class, you're going to learn nothing. But if you know, I'm going in the evening, so I have to support this with my diet, go in the evening, because you're learning a technique. So people around the world can make you learn techniques, but there is no definitive techniques, because techniques are individual. If I tell you, okay, do this, whole days. So technique I can teach you, but is it creating the same effect in you? For me, half matra, when I say, one matra is, let us say 1 blink of eye. So in a half matra, I tell you to do 2 breaths. But with that 2 breaths, my heartbeat might go up with one point. Your heartbeat might not go. Why? Because your physiology is different. But if you say, no, because of this, the heartbeat goes up, and you're searching for it 2 years, my heartbeat is not going up, then you're not learning from the technique. So see, application of breath and understanding of breathing techniques are entirely 2 different things. Breath is only for application. Breath is not for theoretical learning. And asanas and everything supported. Even if I sit in this asana properly, you'll see it is no asana. But if I'm sitting straight, all the gravitational forces are acting on me. I'm not sitting in an AC room. The whatever the environmental factors are working on me. Only then and then I can understand how the prana is working into my system. And these small things which are very cumulative are very important for a strong breathing practice as we go ahead. If under a master, you're following someone, again as said, without any total surrender, and he's just given you one practice and do some mala, then that is something which you are following. You should not look anywhere else. You should not look that, okay, fine, I'm doing this, but I want to improve on it. So this is a mistake I find with a lot of people who come, that they give too much importance to the way a practice is done. It is not important. I can teach you, I can tell you, okay, if you do this, this prana will go into, who has seen Apan? Who has seen Udan? Who has seen Vyan? These are only concepts which are written into the book. So application wise, only the effect will tell you if whatever the action you're doing was right or wrong. That again has to be built up with a consciousness around. And this is how you have to do. Like if I go into mountains at 12,000 feet, only then I can understand if my breathing technique is proper to heat my body. If I sit in Mumbai at 30 degrees and I say my body is getting hot, that is not a measure of it. I have to go out and do it. Only then I'll understand, yeah, fine, this is working. This is the right way I'm doing it. But how many people have the ability to go out and do it? How many people who are in yoga classes or who are in winters take off their clothes in middle of the night go out and practice a breath to warm up their body. Let us say Kapalbhati. Simple thing. You won't be able to. Your muscles will ache. You won't be able to sit. Then you will understand, no, if I have to go out, I have to have some pre-practices. Because I straight away cannot go out in an environment. I have to prepare myself. Then you will understand that I have to put a lot of ghee inside my body so that from inside my body is becoming smooth. It is not that you are doing Abhyanga every day and say, no, I've got a lot of oil in my body, I'll go out. Nothing is going to happen. Because internally the nadi should be with sneha. That is what is written. So these concepts are very applicable concepts. But because we don't test ourselves in real life environment, we are unable to do the diet. We are unable to give up our lifestyle choices. The practices become very redundant. In that, whatever helps you, as I said, then if you're doing a practice for some stressful thing, it is fine. You can take up any practice as long as it is doing the purpose. But if you keep on doing it more and more without stabilizing the body, eventually it is going to cause you some micro circulatory problems into the body. I'm not saying it could be good, it could be bad, but most times it is bad.
Thank you.
Dr. Sumit, here, and a lot of yoga courses and trainings, I think the underlying thing is like the more you learn, the more you feel you're advancing. So like, for example, bandhas. So folks are like, well, I learned this and now I know about the bandhas, Mulband, Udyan, Jalandhar, all of this. So they think they're advancing. But can you speak about I know you alluded to it a little bit about the bandhas, but what are the bandhas? Practically, should people even be practicing those or even learning about them in this day and age? Because that's kind of the underlying thing, is like the more techniques you learn, these bandhas, the mudras, it's this big pot.
See, this is a little bit of a controversial question, but if you ask my experience, I think there's no harm learning them, as long as because these are specialized practices. And when I say specialized practices, not like you're going to get out of body experience. They require a lot of control. If your physiological symptom is not good and you put, apart from Mool Bandha, which is fine, it is a very simple thing. Most of the times involuntarily you get it. You are through it. Voluntarily, it is very difficult to focus the point there because you have to exactly know. Without a proper posture, there is no point of Mool Bandha. So it is very difficult to even go there. So a lot of people can't even put it. But Udyan Bandha and Jalandhar Bandha are something which you physically try to put. And there lies the problem. If those bandhas are not done properly, then they can cause diaphragmatic collapse. They can cause, pneumothorax. A lot of things are there. You will start getting blood vomits if you're forcefully doing it. Jalandhar of it is a very secretive bandha that no one should practice. If somebody is practicing it, then they should really be under supervision because it is very difficult, as we say. And again, there are a lot of other bandhas when you're doing it on inhale. So when you're doing it on retention, it is a little bit fine. Sometimes people do tha bandhas when you're doing it on, after you exhale, you're holding the bandha so that can cause you a break into the artery. They can cause you a stroke. And I've seen a lot of people go through it when they excessively do it because they're pulling their stomach inside. No, Udyan Bandha it is very difficult. It should be a natural process. Every time you are inhaling, your Mool Bandha should be there if you do abdominal breathing. Every time you exhale slowly, your Udyan Bandha will automatically be there. If your body is full, you won't be able to put it because there is some physiological problem into the body. So you don't have to do it forcefully. It is automatically happening. The Jalandhar Bandha is something which you have to do after this breathing becomes very natural to you. And therefore, if you see any text, certain things like Jalandhar Bandha or Plavini breath are not explained. You'll not get any explanation about them apart from a reference. Now, why is it? Because they are something which can cause you harm. So they have to be learned under supervision, under a master only and only after preparing your body. No harm in learning them. As far as mudras are considered, again I said mudra with bandhas will cause you certain seals. Mudra is a seal. So that seals are required when you exactly know where you have to force your prana, where you have to locate something so that you are getting maximum benefit. Again, I said it comes from your geographical, personal, physiological requirement. They're not something you have to learn because you know. So apart, there are a few things like Surya Namaskar you do, good, no problem. You want to do deep abdominal breathing, no problem. You want to do Soham breathing awareness, no problem. When you go into Nadi Shodhan, when you go into specialized breathing techniques like Kapalbhati, Ujjayi, Brahmari, there has to be some kind of a thought process behind doing it over a period of time. So if you do it after that, then it is going to cause a problem. So I think these bandhas and all are something which each one should really think. No harm in learning them because Mool and Udyan bandha are something which automatically are there into the system. But if you try to forcefully do it, it can cause you problem. A lot of people try to do the Ashwini Mudra to know the Mool bandha. Some people put some tennis ball inside, put their heel inside to find the Mool bandha. Now, if you do it at the wrong time, it can cause you nerve damage. It can cause you nerve prolapse. The muscle there can go into paresis. So, these things people should understand when they forcefully do it. And there is no definitive measure of Mool bandha. It occurs separately in separate people. It is not of anatomical side which you can attain. Because in Shastra, everything is measured on Angul Praman. So each Angul is different. My finger breadth is different than yours. So when I say the Mool bandha is 3 Angul above the anus and 2 Anguls below the perineum. So with my Angul, can I measure yours? I cannot. So it is very individualistic. So when we say the prana locates 6 Angul below the navel, it is my 6 Angul. 6 is this. It is not yours. So I can give a definitive idea, but I cannot give a completely perfect idea. It is there. So only when the bandha is locked, you will know yourself when it is locked. I cannot say, oh, your stomach is totally inside, so it is Udyan bandha. No, it cannot be. So only when it is locked and you're getting that breath, you'll know that bandha is proper. If you hold on a little bit more on that bandha, it can cause damage. If you hold it little less, there will be leakage. So as I said, these are, if you want to go into technicalities, it will never end. It is a never-ending practice. So it should be only learned from the master if it is required in your practice, not because it is a part of yogic syllabus.
So folks, feel free to unmute yourself if you have just inquiries or things you're wondering about.
Hello, doctor. This is Hira. Doctor, I wanted to ask regarding the Tantra. It's a very taboo thing in usually amongst common people. Can you explain about, can you give some, throw some light regarding this Tantra?
See, now it is a big topic, so I don't want to intervene in this topic because I think there is a lecture coming up on it, right, Shweta? Yeah. But if I talk about tantric breath, so what happens in Tantra also most of the time, certain practices of Hatha Yogi practices like Sahajoli, Vajroli, whatever it might be, they are on breath. Now, again, as I said, that if you're following a particular cult, a particular thought process, you have to completely immerse in that thought process because it is telling you the same thing. It is not that this is bad, this is wrong. You have a body, it is made up of 5 elements. It has got some prana in it, which is circulating. You have got your vasanas of hunger, thirst, sex, whatever it might be, irrespective of you're a male or a female. Tantric practices were given because you don't require an intermediate. In Vedic practices, what used to happen, you required some priest to do something in your house. Your concept was, samyam, what you call as, you were concentrating on certain upasanas to do because life was very settled in earlier times. After 6 months, your parents gave you to a ashram guru. They said, do whatever you want. So it was your guru to call all care. So, there was complete dedication. Parents did a PTA every 2-3 days, to look at their children. So there was no parent-teacher association in Gurukul. You went. You came back after a period of time. Then you straight away, Guru said, oh, I've tamed his senses, I've retained his power, I've taught him techniques to get through Grihastha Ashram. So he went into Grihastha Ashram for progeny. After Grihastha Ashram was done, what would happen? He enjoyed his sexual life, he enjoyed his Artha life. He said, now I'll go into Vanprastha. So I'll start cutting off this chaos which I was talking about. So it was very structured. So you did not have to think about it. With advent of lot of influence of different religions, Buddhism, Jainism, Ajivikas, Pashupatas, all these things got a lot of influences from different religions. They started creating their own techniques. Somebody used to call as Krichar Sadhak. Krichar Sadhak means they did sadhana by torturing their body, by sitting on nails, by hanging like bats in air. They're doing different breaths. If you go through cults of India, there were certain things they said that no, your body is a alchemical proposition. You need to create it that way to get to higher zones. So the Nath Sampradaya, which did much on alchemy, which did on a mercury, they started. Some people said, no, bhakti is everything. Total surrender is everything. So Sahajiya sect started. These are certain sects of Tantra, which I'm telling. Certain sects said that no, that there is, if everything is 5 elements, even the dead and the non-dead is 5 elements, only through them we understand the elements. of the Aghor cult started. I'm just giving an introduction. Don't take it in a very, because just a small introduction to different things. And from their cults, some people went into Devi Puja. Sri Yantra cult started internally, externally. The Yantra cult started. People who can do it internally, they started from Svotvada. Then some said, no, it is very difficult. Let's have a Yantra outside to do Upasana, to do Sadhana. So householder can do it. And when you do that Upasana Sadhana for a period of time, 10, 2 months, 3 months, 2 years, 3 years, and you get totally immersed in that sadhana, then you might get a Diksha from Guru, because now you are prepared to surrender everything to that sadhana. So all these cults started. Why? Because a time came, they said we cannot be reliant on someone else. We require a personal practice. We require a personal way to finding that point of origin. And that's how this tantric system started, slowly, making it very metaphysical, making it very applicative, making it right down cutthroat. And then you understand when this is like there, its application changes in different forms. Now I can look at some practice and I can go to the extremes to do it. Some people will say, no, so much extreme is not required. Let us balance it. Some people will say, no, we don't want to go outside moral, social conundrums. We'll only do upasanas. So you'll see this influx in tantric practices also. So the execution is not important. What is important is where you can surrender and where you can do all those practices without having a moral, social content. So that is why Tantra is very important in today's world. It was said that Tantra must be practiced in Kali Yuga. Even if you go to Srimad Bhagavatam, it is said that Krishna should be worshipped through Tantra in the Kali Yuga. I don't have the reference, but I'll tell you. So if I'm talking about Srimad Bhagavatam, I'm not talking about Bhagavad Gita. So it is written. And why it is written? Not because that Tantra is something what we think about sexual practices or not. Tantra is a very fundamental way to understand the building blocks of cosmos through your own practices. You take any theory. You can take the theory of Sphota, Trika, or whatever you want, or you can take the Sankhya theory. You can take any theory. How do you approach from everything to nothing is something this practice involves. It involves you, tells you to totally be a part of this practice. And whichever tantric cult you follow, it asks you for that surrender. And once you do that surrender, then whatever that practice involves, you have to adapt to it. It's not a choice. You cannot do it by force. You cannot say, okay, this practice I like, but this I don't like. So this is how, different cults started happening. Even if you say any cult which has a fundamental way of going towards something, it is a Tantra. Tantrism is different thing. What you see in India with black clothes, with bones and all, that is a different thing. That comes in certain parts, but that is not Tantra. Or some people who are just doing sexual practice, that is not Tantra. Tantra, by definition, means a fundamental way to reach from everything to something, or from something to everything. It could be any way, however you look at it. And whatever practice you align with, slowly but surely over a period of time, you engross in it. When you engross in it, suddenly where it is coming from, you might find your Guru, where you can totally be naked there, not thinking of what is your social moral connection, because there is no, personification of what you are. There is no female, male. There is just this pran inside which you want to stabilize, and stabilize so much that everything around it just dissolves. You start understanding these building blocks of nature in a very application way. And that is where this, tantric cults, tantric forms started happening. We started making conundrums about them because from a moral social point of view, we might not agree with certain things, or we might find certain things very bad, because we, as humans, we have a black and white way of looking at nature. So that is why it was said that Tantra is only for the specialized people who can surrender and who really want to do something on their own. Are you able to put in that effort? And in a nutshell, this is where I can give a little bit introduction to it. Of course, I'll speak more about it in the next lecture, when the Shweta is arranged. So maybe we can go more into cults and practices.
Thank you, Doctor.
Can you express about death and breath? I mean, the main topic. Can you show some light on it?
You see, for us, a lot of time death means physical death. But even a cell in your body is dying quickly. It is dying because you are not putting prana in it. So what you are as a body is a conglomerate of all the building blocks, right from when that sperm mashed into the ovum. So we have this concept of linga sharir and gross sharir, whatever it is. So the gross sharir is made up of these 5 elements which dies. The linga sharir, which is there with the mother's nadi, which is born, passes on migration to migration. So when this gross body is there, it sustains. It is an enclosure for this linga sharir, for this sukshma sharir, this pran, what we say, which is animating the system. The more you can translate, the more it can sustain in your body, because it is always looking to go out. It is not looking to remain. You'll see, the moment you are born, you're going towards death. You're not getting like younger. You're getting older. The pran is trying to go out. It is spending more. It is retaining less. The concept of breath, what we say, is to make it retain more. Why? Because you don't want to look like a hero 200, 300 years. But you want to attain that, because even if you have to attain this stability, you can only attain it with a gross body. You cannot attain it with an ethereal body. There is nothing called as an ethereal body. It transmigrates. And that is where these concepts of breath and death come, that you have to understand that each and every cell which is functioning in this body is because of this pran. Can I ensure that this pran is reaching it till it can? It is not that, that there are certain yogis who you have heard that, they throw out their energy through the Brukati, what you call. So what does that tell you? I don't want to go into annals if it is true or false, but just I will take it as a example. Here there is a voluntary release of pran, so gross body is not dying. And there are yogis who want to get out of their body, but they are not dying because the pain is so much. So pran is not going anywhere. So these examples give you the difference of why breath is so much important. Breath is important because you must have a voluntary control of when it leaves and when it not, where it leaves from.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Rishikesh here. Maybe a silly question, but generally when you say you do Surya Namaskar, it is said that you breathe properly and you will get more benefits out of it. And then you stretch your muscles and things like that. So breathing is basically you are helping get more out of your exercises or whatever. But does it work the other way, that if you don't exercise but just focus on breathing, does it still help your internal organs, your muscles and bones and other things?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very good question. See, again, I give this example that when you have a good sleep and the moment you get up, you do like a yawn, oh, fine. You are putting prana in all your body. You don't require to do exercise. That one stretch, which is brain, is giving you benefit of 3,000 stretches. But if you're half sleepy, you get up because you have to do some Surya Namaskar and you're doing it, then it is giving you no benefit. So why Surya Namaskar earlier was done? People used to stay in very cold environments. There was no curtain environments. Body used to get stiff. So, they used to get up. Yogis used to do it first initially. Why? Because they used to stay in this cave environments, isolated environments. So you have to get up into the morning, do their morning kriya, their motions and everything done. And then when the sun rises, they used to do this Surya Namaskar so that with proper breathing techniques, so that because of the sun, the urja is going all into the body. Once that happened, it gave them that much pran, bank balance to go through the day so that they can spend it. Now what we are doing is that we are taking those techniques. You could go to Ashtanga or anything. You feel good. Why? Because you feel your muscles are loose, everything is fine. You can put one leg from here, all these things. So this was never meant. Yogis never meant to do it. Eventually, their body became so supple, so subtle that they can move it anywhere they like. Their portion of difficult Kricha Asana was what? That even if I'm putting my legs here, it is paining me. Can I still be still? Because we have to test out, right? Because stillness is something you can take for granted. I can say, okay, now I'm happy. I can't eat. I can't do. But Maya is that, are you challenging yourself more? Can you stand in, you have been to Banaras, you see, some yogis just stand in one leg and the other leg gets totally emaciated. One person is with the hand like this, is standing for 1 year, that hand is getting totally emaciated. These are like Krichara Sadhara, extremes. But if you understand the Gudhartha from it, why they are saying that can I find stillness by doing this asana? So the quotient is that if you're doing Surya Namaskar at the expense of your sleep, at the expense of your stillness, how much breath you take inside is not going to give you any benefit. But if everything is there, you're getting up on time, sleeping on time, your body is devoid of things, you're doing that Surya Namaskar properly, even 9 Surya Namaskar properly, with proper breath, retention of breath, throwing out of breath, then eventually what will happen, it will start slowing up in your system. It's not that you're doing Bhujanga Asana, you're just getting no, how much can you retain that asana? A point till it becomes uncomfortable, or a point till you have to exhale that breath. Does that awareness come? If that awareness comes, even 1 Surya Namaskar would be fine. Now, sometimes people suggest you should do it very fast, 12 Surya Namaskar. Some yogis say. Nothing wrong in it. But must everybody do it? Maybe a obese person can do it. Maybe a lethargic person can do it. So that is an exercise. So Vyayam is separate from breath. Now, the second question comes that can you maintain your body on breath? So I can tell you from my experience, I don't do Surya Namaskar. I don't know. Now I'm here for 2 months. I have not even gone for a walk. I walk a lot. I'm just maintaining on breath. So there is nothing wrong. There is no thing. If I say that, that because I'm not exercising, I should grow fat. I'm not. So only if you know breath properly, you can increase and decrease the heat into your system. You can manipulate. So breath, therefore, is very important. Hence it comes Yam, Niyam, Asana and Pranayam. So once you go into the Pranayam, Yam, Niyam, Asana is not required. But that Pranayam, in that doing that Pranayam, if your Yam, Niyam are not properly curtailed, then that stage of Pranayam is also bad. So Pranayam once means that you have become so stable into your system that nothing should affect you. Your breath should be so strong to curtail the Agni that even if you eat crap, it should digest. Or even if you eat nothing, it should not, like what you give the example of Bharat, Jarana, you give it after it is processed, you give it any food, it is not going to increase in size. Even if you take it out for something, it is not going to decrease in size. So the whole concept of breath is to stabilize your Agni, not only on the gross level, but also on the micro level. And because each muscle, each tone only acts when this fuel is proper. And this was the concept of it. So Vyayam, what you called, is again Vyayam, when we say that expansiveness, control of something. So you have to do Vyayam. There is no exercise is not Vyayam. Vyayam is when you have complete control over all your actions. When the prana is spreading in all directions. So therefore it is called Vyayam. When you join it, it becomes Vyayam. Similarly, Pran Ayam. It is not like control of breath. Pran and Ayam. When you have voluntarily control of Pran in its expense or its retention, you go into Pranayam. The techniques you use are just complementary for it.
Thank you. Made a lot of sense.
Dr. Sumit, I have a specific question about Kapalabhati, because a lot of, I find it to be an advanced breath in a way, even though it seems like the easiest thing to do. And often I'll see an Ayurvedic practitioner recommending it with a protocol to deal with whatever disease or imbalance that they're having. And I'm usually strongly advise against that, you know, especially when a person is in a disease state. You know, that just samavritti, or at the most some kind of nadi shodhana could be possible to be calming the system. So if you agree or not, could you speak about that, what it does to, how it can be disruptive to the person, and especially when it's a female patient too?
See, it's a good question. As I say, I don't comment much on recommendations because, as you know, every Ayurveda practitioner has got his own way of dealing. Okay. So if somebody has incorporated something into his practice, then maybe you have to go with it and understand. If you ask me just on a very technical basis, so I would never recommend an yogic practice to anyone unless and until their body is stable.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, where there is no ongoing disease, you know, anything. Mentally, I can understand. You know, you're stressed, I can understand. But as long as physiologically nothing is there, I'll never. Why? Because these practices are putting micro afflictions on your hormonal glands. They're putting some conjunction on your kidney, on your thyroid, you know, breast glands. This they are putting. And what happens if you can't do it at a right way? Like Kapalbhati is there. You know, it increases heat into your body. A lot of people do it to increase metabolism. If you're thyroid, you're obese, do Kapalbhati. So you'll lose your weight. Again, as I said, that fat person and obese person are two different things. A fat person, I've seen a lot of sadhus in my life in Himalayas who are like, you look at them, you'll see he can't even move an inch. He can climb faster than you. I've seen a lot of sadhus who are like this, they can't even climb 2 steps, people. So that is not a measure of your health. Health is when this stagnation is there. And when you start doing these practices like Kapalbhati, you know, first of all, you have to understand it is a forceful exhale and involuntary inhale. You know, so if I'm doing, so this is Kapalbhati. If I do, this is going to cause blood vessel rupture. Are you doing it properly? So these are subtle difference. You will not know. And when women do it, you know, it is a uterus there. If you're putting it from the belly inside, and if there is an ongoing dysmenorrhea going, metrorrhagia going, got it? Some ovarian cyst is going. You know, it can cause a rupture if the muscles are not proper. Because you're putting too much of pressure for exhale. Because you see, if you do Kapalbhati over a period of time, it is going to increase your heart rate. It is going to throb it inside. Why? Because you're doing forceful inhale and forceful exhale. That inhale must be involuntary. Like if I do, so see, inhale is involuntary. But when I do, there is no, after 3 exhales, I'm doing 1 inhale. And this stability is not there. And therefore, these practices must not be done. As per my thought process, but if somebody or a doctor is guiding it in a much milder way, that is something which is confined to that particular doctor. I won't comment on it. If you ask my view, just solitary my view, this is how I look at it.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Alex, I don't know if you're there, but I saw you raising your hand earlier, so maybe you're not there.
Doctor, I have a perhaps a silly question, but just from your expertise, how would because here in the West, you know, of course, the Tantra path, if you want, has been so distorted. I find, and you know, here in the West, in a lot of the communities I've been, the emphasis has been on the sexual part. Could you explain a little bit more about the actual tradition itself and how you feel about, because there are so many paths to, they all lead to one, but yeah, I just wanted to know maybe a little more distinction around that, and I don't know, say something extreme like the Angora path. Thank you.
That is a good question. Again, I thought Shweta should have kept weekend lecture on Tantra and breath on Tuesday. But anyways, I'll just elaborate on what you said. See, it doesn't matter what practices you're doing. See, here the quotient lies is that we are giving too much importance to a practice path. Somebody might feel I have got a lot of sexual energy, I want to go to the sexual path. It is not, that practice is not about sex. Here the practice is, are you prepared to know your inner energy? You have to go through a lot of processes of diet, lot of things, because gratification, when you are into that practice, the manifest of who is with you should not be there. It is what you are absorbing, what you are not, but you have to build towards it. Certain practices were done to fast track this. There are certain, like you want to get into a trance, some people drink alcohol. So you fast track it, because if I have to get into that state to do something, I'll have to waste 10 minutes doing breath. So let us say if I take a drink of alcohol, I get into that state, I can fast track it. Some people will say that no, even these 5 makars which are given, madhya is given, it's not alcohol, it is something else. If Congress or sex is said, it is not, it is a bali that you are offering your body and nothing is there. So the whole concept comes is that you have certain vasanas into your system. They are created by your system because the Shiva and Shakti lives within you. Are you ready to go to highest point of situation where there is no validation, no justification, no gender bias, nothing? Only and only this breath practice, which is helping you understand this synonym, helping you understand this tangent between these two forces where creation is trying to go out or the creation is trying to absorb. This small tension between where it is about to happen but not happening. Can you do that? But for that, you have to prepare a body. You have to, because then certain things, certain channels into your body are going to get ruffled. Certain parts in your body are going to get hit. If the same thing, if you tell a woman that, we'll teach you orgasmic practices on your own, can they reach that spots? Why? Because over a period of time, that uterus has become so plastic due to social conditioning. Being a mother, being a girlfriend, leading a life of gratification, picking up hormonal discords. So for some people who just want to get through and understand with the concepts, surrender to what is required in terms of food, who don't have this concept of no, veganism, vegetarianism, non-vegetarianism. They see everything as 5 elements, building blocks of what it is. For them, that practice is a very fast-paced practice. For some people who have all these notions of this, they are not wrong. For them, there is another practice. But that doesn't mean that practice is wrong, this practice is good. Because it is not something which you have to validate for others. It is not a syllabus. Are you progressing? Are you getting that? So one person can go from one sampradaya to another sampradaya depending upon the stillness. Why does he make the switch? Not because that sampradaya is teaching something well. He's giving you more handwritten notes. Because you want to fast track. You think you have evolved. Sometimes I come from a conservative family. I will start with a practice which aligns with my thought. Eventually, in my own education, I'll understand maybe whatever I was thinking as a child is not right. I'm seeing world differently. Then those practices which you abhorred start making sense to you. You want to go there. And this is what everyone should understand. When I'll tell you the story, maybe I've told it thousands of times, that when I went first to an Agor, I was thrown shit and urine at my head. So I thought he's a madman. I still persisted. And when I went, he taught me metaphysics in the best English language that even I cannot speak. So then you understand these people do certain things so that I am a nuisance for them. But have I transcended that? If I felt, hey, this is a madman, he's throwing urine, what will he know? No, he's going there, he's squatting, he's eating something. But that is for him, for the world to show that do not come and disturb. Can you look beyond that? So you make this parallels with a sexual practice. It is not about the act. It is about your own evolvement of how much you want to progress. And then if you progress, you'll find really a practitioner who can teach you, or somebody who's just giving you a theory. Because that you'll see the stillness in your guru. It is not that because I know 20 techniques, I can teach you. If there is no stillness in me, I cannot teach you.
Can I ask, in relevance to today because because of what's happening on the planet, this complete shift that we're in right now of consciousness, I would say. That there are, I would say there's some allegiances to darker forces that want to take very much advantage of this. In the realm of like the Ayurvedic traditions or the Vedic traditions, these dark and light forces, you know, most of us want to be good and progress and evolve from our conditions. But those darker forces, that it's the same way they just learn their commitment is just to a darker path. I'm trying to understand. I mean, maybe it's not to even be understood. You know, I don't know that it can be understood.
I'll give you a small example. See, if you understand, which I've talked in my previous lectures, there is nothing called as good and bad on a fundamental level. What is good for you is bad for someone. If this thing is happening where everybody is going down in economy, some people are putting their heads and making money. Now, you cannot say that, why are you making money? No one has stopped you. You're saying because I'm not making, he's making. Tomorrow, let us say something opens up and one person takes a chance to go out and work. You will also take a chance and go out to work because you will feel, no, he'll take up my job opportunity. So these dark and light forces are constantly there within you. That is the reason, you know, in Rig Veda, the first Ratri Sukta talks about it, from which all Tantrism develops. That is this first Sukta, Ratri Sukta. It's a small hymn. You should watch it, read it in Rig Veda again and again, and you should elaborate on its meaning. If you elaborate on its meaning, all these things become very clear.
Where do I find that?
It's Rig Veda, Ratri Sukta. You can just, Devi Sukta, you know, a lot of people read it in Tantra, you know, but if you read it from the Rig Vedic point of view, it's very easily available. So Ratri Devi is given where it is said that the quotient is there are light forces and there are dark forces. And they both are fighting with each other so that dark forces get annihilated. And people talk it as a concept of good and evil. It is not a concept of good and evil. It is a concept that in each and every manifestation, these forces are inherent. Sometimes you are dark, sometimes you are light. You know, one man's savior is other man's terrorist, as we say. So we should, as an individual, should not make these associations on a spiritual path. You have to only and only look for your stability within. What is keeping you stable? You have said that I am manifested, nothing is manifested. But again, you are making this concept. No, you know, I should not be earning money because I'm taking, you're not taking from anyone. Today you are earning money. Tomorrow you might not earn money for 6 months. So that money, what you have earned it together. That's what the Ratri Sukta tells you. But if you say, no, I have made a lot of money, I should not be making money. And tomorrow you will say that I gave up so much of money for these people. Now no one is giving me money. So sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. So Vedic knowledge is all about cutting this clutter internally. Externally, you are a part of a society, you have to do your job. No one is telling you to not do your job. You support a cause, you give your time, that's about it. But you're not being a part of the clutter. You're doing only those things what you feel is right, what is keeping your stability. So I might support a cause, a political party. That doesn't mean that I align with it. I'm just supporting that party on my internal way because it is allowing me and my thought processes to stay put. I'm not going to argue with others why I'm supporting it. I'm not here to convince anyone. And each one in their spiritual path, if they start cutting this clutter in an applicable way, you know, it becomes a very good practice. Our problem happens is that any spiritual practice is associated with a moral high ground. It could be veganism, it could be slaughter, it could be food, it could be environment, it could be whatever you can take. Because we feel, no, this dark forces, or it could be money. It's nothing like that. So once we start understanding that we cannot change anything, we are a part of the change. The only thing is to create the stillness within you and cut the chaos in your brain. Then only your practice becomes high. And that is the reason why, you know, a lot of people in yogic life, they have been through this stress, but eventually they go. Why? Because they don't have to prove anything to anyone. Here I'm taking a lecture. So it doesn't mean I have to prove anyone that, okay, I know so much. I'm taking a lecture because what I feel is right, I'm telling you. How you absorb it in a longer run depends upon your practice. So if I am saying making sense, I'm making sense in a very unbiased way. You might not agree with me, but you cannot deny it. Because I'm not justifying my choices. I'm telling you, fine, even I am part of it. Someday I might be a villain in someone's life, a hero in someone's life. I do not make the choice. They have made the choice. If I tell you something, you can hold guilt against me, grudge against me, or you can be very happy. Have I made a choice to say, no, I want to induce guilt in you? No. So this is what the Ratri Sukta tells you. If you read it, again, there is a Bhavartha, there is a translation, which is the Devi Sukta. You should not go for it. You should read it again and again, and then combine it with what is happening around you. And that is the only sukta from where tantric origin started happening.
Interesting. Shweta, can you post that if you know, or maybe Doctor, you can post like a link of that to.
Okay, I'll post it to Shweta and maybe she can. I don't have access for typing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Appreciate it.
Doctor, okay, sir.
Yeah.
I just want to give an input of what I understand from the Vedic perspective. What I understand personally, because is that when the act of sex, when you reach the climax, especially the man, he loses a lot of energy. What is understood is ayus. And he said it takes like 30 days to recover that amount of semen that you just ejaculated when you were doing the sexual act. Am I wrong with this, or is something that is stated in the scripture, in the Ayurvedic text?
See, what you are talking about is on a gross level. So when you release the energy in an act of sex, it takes that much more time to recover for the body to put that energy. Like you talked about semen. So from 100 counts of blood, 1 drop of semen is created, or whatever it is. So that is not wrong, because that is for a therapeutic purpose. But again, when we are talking about sexual practice, it is not got nothing to do with gross sex. It is about understanding how much pran is being, spent for each act. So the act of sex is a completely different thing. It is a very natural process of procreation which happens in a lot of people. So when you do it without awareness, just for the sake of doing it, you start losing that kind of a vitality, and eventually what happens, problems start occurring. Uterus becomes this. So that is completely different from what you're talking. But if you're talking on a very Vedic point of view, Ayurvedic point of view, there are a lot of people who indulge in a lot of sexual practices. Eventually they start getting problems, premature or whatever. Women start getting other kind of problems. So that when we do the treatment and we arrange it in a particular way in time, it is fine. You understand. But in Vedic sense, if I have to cross over both the things, then everything in the body is given in type of a praman. Praman means quantity, how much it is there. So if that quantity is very minuscule, and that is like a nano quantity into your body, if there is a nano quantity which is producing a gross quantity. So gross quantity goes on depleting and again replenishing. The moment the nano quantity goes away, you start getting disease. The nano quantity has to be only replenished by proper diet discipline or by breath practices. So here, when we are talking about sexual practices, we are afflicting these nano quantities. We are trying to neither increase it, neither decrease it, keep it pure and stable. So this is called as Anjali Praman in Ayurveda. If you have learned Ayurveda, you will come to know. These are the nano quantities. So when we say Raj, it is 4 Anjali, Artav, it is half Anjali. Now you can say half Anjali, Anjali is like this. So you cannot say, okay, this much of blood. So this is the nano quantity. Now, sometimes we say when a woman has to go through menses, new menstrual blood must be created. But a lot of women shed the old blood. So the nano quantity gets affected, it gets this. So see, these are like small things which you cannot read in translations. You have to learn from someone and through it by applications. In tantric things, only and only these nano quantities are afflicted, these nano quantities are not. When you know this nano quantity through your breath, you understand even if you're getting aroused, how your breath is changing. Even if you're trying to throw out, what your breath is changing. Should you, not should you? So, these are learned slowly but surely. So one is for therapeutic purpose, which is fine, which you are absolutely right. But that has to be looked into from that point. You cannot replenish something in 30 days because if the nano quantity is proper, even if you shed anything, it is still getting created. So you don't need to replenish it. It will get replenished on its own. And even if you don't have sex, and yet the nano quantity is affected due to your wrong dietary habits, you still get problems. So this is called as Anjali Praman, which is very well mentioned in both Ayurvedic texts. If you can look up to it, it is very simple chapter, 1-2 page chapters. But if you understand it, you understand all these quantities, not only of semen and everything, whatever fluidity, whatever hormones are there into your system, all nano quantities are given, and their balance gives you health.
So the reason I came up to this point is because if you want to use the energy, the pranic energy, for some subtle practices like meditation and connect with God, it says that it's very important to conserve this energy in order to go to those subtle levels of connection with God.
No, see, this is a nice question. So again, as I said, most of the male practices are celibate practices. Why? Because we don't replenish this energy. This nano energy is already there within us for one point. So our practices become retrograde, celibacy. In a woman, that is not there. In a woman, menses occurs every month. So the moment it flows out properly, then nano quantity is maintained. If it gets stuck, it is not maintained. And that is the reason women who do celibate practices develop hormonal issues. So gender-wise, the practices are different, yet the concept is the same. You have to re-pull the energy up. You have to make it move up. I'm not talking Kundalini. There is a Udan Vayu which gives you strength. So you have to use that to go up. But you have to cultivate it, because it is not something which you can cultivate as natural. As you build your strength with proper exercise, and only then you can lift. So what you're doing, you're making that Vayu strong. If I tell you tomorrow, get up and pick up 10 pounds, you might not be able to. You'll break something. But if you practice every day with proper discipline, you will be able to lift it up. Same thing happens with sexual energy. Because it is a Visarga energy, it is going down. You have to maintain that nano energy to put up. For that, you require proper meditation, proper diet, proper discipline, and most importantly, a proper decluttered mind. You cannot just pull it through practice. Retention of semen doesn't mean that you are doing the practice up. It means when you are connecting with this nanoparticle, this nano point, and can you keep it completely quotient, completely vibrating. And this practices slowly but surely are learned through different cults. Some people use mercury, some people use some other things to stabilize it. So we have to understand it from a very all-inclusive point of view. A lot of people say, do brahmacharya, do meditation. I'm not saying it is wrong. It is good for the society to do it. But eventually, it is not leading to anything. Most of the times, it only leads to a hello that I'm into a very extracurricular zone. If you're happy with it, great. No one is complaining. But if you abide by it, as I said, it's different, because your quantities, though the nano quantity is same, its expression is different in you, different in me, and it changes with your practice. If you do a diet, it will change. If you don't do a diet, you will feel lethargic. If that is the energy which is giving you replenishment, you'll see that when you are like very lethargic, that energy is not working for you. When you've done a diet, you feel light, you will feel more on energy. So we can understand this from very practical aspects. You don't require a meditation to understand it. And once you understand these practical aspects, you can voluntarily control it for your higher gains in whatever school of thoughts you follow.
Thank you. I have another question. What is the have you put it to any practice the pranayama for healing when you have patients? Do you have have you put that? Do you have some kind of techniques for that?
No, as I said, that for me, the patient comes, I put them first on a very strict diet if they're ready to do it. If they do it, automatically the breath gets stabilized. The breath gets stabilized, you're already in pranayama, as long as you can maintain the diet. After that, if you want to go much higher into understanding the stability, maybe you have to find some guru under which you have to learn it. Because for me, on my part, I avoid giving any breathing techniques to anyone. Because I don't think if I cannot supervise it, it is not right on my part to give it. The simple thing what I can say is simple abdominal breathing, slow breathing. When you observe your breath, you sit calmly and if you just do that properly sitting, that is fine. Maybe I can just talk about it today or tomorrow. We have got 2 days, but that is the only thing I tell. But not when you are diseased. When you are in a stable, your body is free of disease, little bit, you feel that, I'm in good health. Though you might be taking some medicines, it doesn't matter. Then you can only do is deep abdominal breathing, slow down your breathing. Even if you do that properly, it is as good as 320 pranayams. Reason is that there is no technique which is going to give you something. If you do one technique also properly, you are going to get the effect. What technique is all inclusive, for which you don't have to do an effort. You don't have to keep time aside. It is happening. It's like I'm talking with you. If I'm aware of my breath, I don't have to go after the lecture and do the breath. So, that technique which becomes all inclusive is your pranayama, because you're voluntarily doing it. Right now also we are involuntarily breathing. But if you voluntarily breathe, it becomes pranayama. So there is no separate technique for it. The whole thing, it should rest on some discipline. And a lot of people confuse, no, this is an easy technique. I want a difficult technique. I want to learn something which is, but what exactly you are getting by doing that technique, no one knows. It shows good, but what are the effects? And everybody should use these techniques for this long-term effect, is to cut the clutter and do a practice which is all inclusive, so that only and only you can be stable in your mind. You don't have to have the stress of doing all these practices again and again. Get up, do something, then sit for meditation. Okay, my office time is there, go, come back. Concept of pranayama is not there. Concept of pranayama is to declutter all these things. You don't have to wake up to eat, cook food. You are already so calm that you don't have to worry. You know that you are going to get up at particular time. You know you are going to get hungry at particular time. What is you are going to eat doesn't matter to you. You are aware of your breath. Once the stability comes, pranayama comes. And after that, the internal practices of dhyan, dharanas, pratyahar, whatever it is comes. Because once it is stable, then only you can put one pointed focus on something. So this is in general, in a nutshell, I'm giving you a concept of breath. Differs from school to school, teacher to teacher, sampradaya to sampradaya.
So is there a correlation with the pulses when you diagnose the pulse on a patient? The breathing in the channels?
I don't do pulse diagnosis. I don't do pulse diagnosis because in Ayurveda there are various types of diagnosis. So I never done pulse diagnosis in my life.
Oh, okay.
That is one of the techniques to learn Ayurveda, but that is not the only one to do it. There are 8 types of diagnostic methods in Ayurveda. You can see a person, you can listen a person, you can ask a person, you can touch a person, you can do pulse, you can do urine, but the pulse diagnosis, because it comes from the south, it is the most propagated form. It is the most taught form.
Thanks.
Dr. Sumit, I think one of the other concepts or learnings that people often get infatuated with is around nadis as the intellectual stimulation, I guess, around Ida, Pingala, Shushumna, and then its relation with Kundalini awakening. And so can you kind of break that down and simplify because obviously how you're feeling is affecting the Ida Pingala nadis, right? Because it already knows what it needs to do and it's operating to create a balance within your system. But then once again, these daily habits of your diet, lifestyle habits, etc., affect this pranic flow within these nadis. And so in the big picture, kind of what is happening, because these are these concepts that are wonderful and people love learning about them, but is it of any use? And
see, I'm not saying it is a good concept, the Ida Pingala. Then some people more intellectually talk about Kuhu Nadi, Chitrini Nadi, Nadi within a Nadi. So, sometimes this concept should not get over to your head. Some people say I've got control over Ida Pingala. Now I'm putting Pran into my Chitri. So are you telling this because you have read it? or you can locate it. So this concept was come that in your system there is a sun and a moon. Now there is no like sun and a moon. There is a hot and a cold, and one is increasing the stabilizing heat, and whenever there is decrease of heat or increase of heat, it is going to cause some disbalance. The whole concept is to maintain that heat wherever into your body, because when you die, your body becomes cold. So we are talking about micro heat and macro heat. See, in the beauty of Vedic sciences is that you can approach it from all directions. It is not like modern science that, okay, this charak means charak. No, you use anything. If you know the concepts, books do not matter. These are algorithmic concepts. So in Hatha Yoga, it was said that there is a sun and a moon, ha and a tha. You have to balance it. You have to combine it. You have to see to it that one is not, intimidating the other. Both are in such a balance that the flow of prana is irrespective. So they understood that there is one Ida Nadi through which the sun channel operates, the Pingla, the moon, vice versa. And when you control it voluntarily, of which channel is when, depending upon the geographical conditions, eventually you stabilize the prana. When you stabilize the prana with proper bandhas and all, eventually you get, I'm just combining certain concepts, you will know whatever I've said, you will get control over the udana, because that energy will enter that small channels. It could be a hormonal channel, it could be a hormonal burst, it could just be an access to a nervine impulse, which is giving you voluntary control of all the energy. So can you control your heart rate on your own? No. Can you control your lungs collapsing and increasing on your own, how much blood goes inside? No. Can you control the flow to the brain on your own? No. But eventually start getting that control. Eventually do certain practices to keep that control there by bandhas, which we call as granthis, because granthis are hallmark that you have gotten over your physical vices, because first granthi lies just above Manipur, where all your outside vices are taken care of, sexual curves, eating habits, this habit. Then you go to the Vishnu, whatever the next granthi is, where you have got complete control over your circulation, swara. And then you go towards the last granthi, where completely there is a one-pointed focus. So again, I'm saying, if you correlate the entire lecture what I took, the concepts are the same. Which school you follow makes it easier for you to imbibe this concept, because you have to relate with something, right? I cannot tell you, okay, driving is the same, drive a truck. You are not going to drive a truck. You are going to first learn somewhere where you are comfortable with driving. If you understand the concepts, you will, okay, fine, I can drive anything. Some people will say, I can only drive this car on this road. I can't take my car to another place because I don't know. So their concepts remains there. Some people understand the quotient of driving and they say, it doesn't matter where I am, just bring on the car, I'll drive, because the concept is the same. So Vedic concepts, as I said, the Vedic deities were converted into Vishnu and Shiv and Shakti. The multitudes, the one deity of multitude Vedic deities were converted to Vishnu, Shiv as Puranic lore or this lore came, and they are Shaktis. Eventually, they started getting understood through the mantras, the upasanas, whatever. And the Vedic hymns, which was giving an internal, psychic, spiritual experience, started getting converted into a psychosomatic experience with yogi. So everything is the same. It is not different. Even in Vedas, if hundreds of gods are given, they talk about the one Avyakta, the one Brahman, the one Pranava. Even in Tantras, if Shiva Shakti is given, they talk about Shaktiman, which is with Shiva and Shakti. It is not separate. Now, if you go to a tantric point of Shakti tradition, they will say Shakti is same, but it is not. The Shiv is latent. If you go to the Trika part, Shiv is common, Shakti is within it. It comes out through Visarga, but eventually it is the one. So techniques help you simplify things. Pick a tradition where you can align. Eventually what happens, you get completely surrender in those techniques and eventually start happening. But again, as I said, too much of intellectual thoughts, too much of translation, too much of books. Actually, if you make you believe that, no, I have broken my Rudra Granthi, I've broken my Brahma Granthi, I've got my Vayu into Chitrini Nadi, Kuhuna, and that is a concept, because this Nadis physically cannot be isolated. You have to understand it through your stillness of what is happening. So therefore, I said, not translated books and application of the translation are two different things. And once you start practicing it with proper effort, you start to align with these concepts.
Doctor, I have a question. You spoke about eating right to stabilize prana. So how does actually prana and food interact, or how do they stabilize each other?
See, prana is like a fuel. Anytime you do something which puts stress on it, it is going to get. So when there are certain times in your body when the flow of prana is facilitated, it is like what time your milkman is going to come. So If you align your body with it, then you know how much quantity of milk is going to come, because that is what only you can afford. But eventually, when you understand that it doesn't matter, no, that my money, that still I know budgeting what is happening, that food and diet puts less taxation on the prana. Today you're eating something which is getting digested, getting converted into food. Suddenly you go out and you eat something spicy, whatever it is not there, and you start getting this lot of acid into your system. You start feeling bad, you're starting gases. What is happening? You have curtailed or you have exploited the flow of prana. And that is the reason why diet and discipline is required. Once you reach a stage where diet and discipline has made your prana so strong, you can take liberties, not because you want to make, but maybe it could be the reason. So again, as I said, that treatment of the gross body is a completely different thing. If somebody wants to just maintain their body and enjoy life, okay, I want to be disease free, follow a particular dincharya, eat something, make peace with something and go. If somebody wants to transcend these choices, they want to say, I don't want to wake up every day thinking what I'm going to eat, which is right and wrong. I don't want to go out thinking I'm going to get confusion of thoughts. Then the meditative practice helps you, because it is your stillness. The moment you're still, you're hungry, you will eat something to feed your body. Even in that zone, if it is a wrong thing, because your Agni is so strong, you won't get any benefit. You will get all the benefits. But if you say that, oh no, I want to eat something which I feel is sattvic, but you eat at the wrong time, it is still going to get converted into acid. And that is the mistake we make. We think we are eating right. There is nothing called as eating right in Ayurveda. Ayurveda doesn't make difference between good food and bad food. It only gives you the property of food. You have to make sense around it. But we think, no, in Ayurveda it is written vegetarianism is bad. Nothing is written like that. Rituals require certain kind of practices. If you say that I'm doing a particular ritual, this thing I should know, that is only related to that ritual. If you come to a particular family, in your family certain food is not allowed, because in your family somebody was doing something, like a priest in a temple, where these things were not looked upon good. There was no bloodshed, nothing. So fine. But there are still Brahmins in North India who eat meat, in Uttarakhand and all. Why? Because it is their tradition. So we have to separate these things, algorithms from tradition and conditioning. Algorithms are always same for everyone, in whatever era you are. You rise with the sun, you sleep with the moon. The ha and the tha, what I called of Ida Nadi and Pingla Nadi, it is the same. You rise with the sun, eat with the sun, sleep with the sun, eat at right times when your Agni is at its maximum best. For that, you have to first cultivate that Agni. If that Agni is cultivated, only then that Agni will go into your small channels and it will help you nourish. Because again, it is not about the gross, it is about the Sukshma, which is lying into your body. As when the first sperm and the ovum is created, the Sukshma Sharir gets inside and life occurs. It is that Linga Sharir which is keeping you animated, not the seminal fluid thing of the gross body which you are doing. So let us say now, some people are very vital. You see sadhus, you look at them, you'll find, wow, why it is this prana which is stabilizing them. And you'll see a lot of practitioners who are doing a lot of pranayam practices, but their skin, dark circles, skin is jaded. No prana. Body might look stable. Blood and all values might be stable, but no prana. Why? Because of this coherence. And therefore, once we start understanding it, we do it. In my practice, as you have been my patient, this is a small indirect thing I try to instill in everyone who comes. Maybe 2 months, 3 months, give it a go. See how your breath goes. So you get a methodology to check that tomorrow when I go out and I eat something, how it is affecting me. If you're honest enough, you'll come to know what I'm saying. You cannot develop and say, I did 2 months, now I can eat anything. No, it is a continuous practice. If you want to develop and eat everything what you like, you have to first cultivate that source. You're not like you're just coming out of the womb and coming to me. Before you come to someone, you have already created that nuisance in your body. So, even I am not immune to it. When I started, even I had created nuisance into my body. But it is a constant struggle of awareness which you do over a period of time, and be honest. And once you're honest, all these theories of Ayurveda, Veda, Yoga become a contributing factor. But if you become so very naive to, no, in Vedas it is said Ayurveda it is said I should get up, do Abhyanga, do oil pulling, I'm doing everything. Live with that. Nothing is going to happen.
Thank you.
Like what I have understood a little bit in Ayurveda it has said in Dincharya that do Abhyanga, oil pulling and all that. So you're trying to say that the same thing which I think last time also I mentioned, that you observe yourself, is it required or not, and then do all the Dincharya things, or you just follow? What should be
See,
the...
Dincharya things I'm not saying are not wrong, but you have to understand in what geographical context they were written. Earlier, people used to travel on bullock carts. Body used to get roughed up. You require Abhyanga. If you do it in your AC room every day, you're going to get problem with your bones. See, I'm not saying what there is written is wrong. It is a translation, but you don't have to do everything. You don't have to do Danta Dhavan, because see, that time geographical conditions were different. Today, you're staying in a curtailed environment. You stay in the AC and you'll get up and you'll do massage. What is the use? Or you're in a hot climate of 40 degrees, you're sweating, you go and do a massage. What is the use? So first Svedana is occurring, then you're doing Snehan. What is the use? So see, these concepts therefore have to be practiced under a supervised Ayurveda practitioner. You can, just because they are Ayurvedic, you cannot pick up and do everything. Eat ginger before food because it increases. But do you know what your digestion quotient is? Just because you're getting constipation, you mean you need to eat ginger and garlic. Some people want to lose weight, they'll start drinking warm water before food. So if you drink warm water before food, you will lose weight. So is it a right thing to do? Won't you get a peptic ulcers? So see, people, because if you go a little bit ahead in Ayurveda, the hetu of a lot of diseases is given. Even drinking more water will cause you weak joints in the long run. But we don't look at this Arishta Lakshanas. You know, people only take what they feel is good because it is Ayurvedic. So the best thing is align with the sun and the moon. Get up on time, sleep on time, eat on time. If you want to do a little bit much better, because in today's world our Agnis are weak, don't eat sour food, fermented food. Don't even eat fruits loaded with sugar. Eat cooked food, because you're not getting fresh fruit. You're getting fruit which is packaged from New Zealand. So no use this constant rancid sugar. But if you say no, fruits are good, nuts are good, then you're doing your body a disservice, because you eat wheat or meat, body is not going to distinguish. It is going to break it down on its constituents, on its Panchabhavati constituents. So see, there is a constructive cultural association with food. I'm not going into it. You know, if your family follows, if your culture demands that you refrain from certain kinds of food, it is good enough. But you can still make do with foods in the right time and you won't require anything. So let us say you have come from a very long trek, you have gone to hike in the Himalayas, your body is becoming, you'll know that it's roughened up. Go and do Abhyanga, no one is telling you wrong. If you stay in a very cold environment and body is getting dried up, do Abhyanga once, it is required. But if you're staying in a cold environment in a heater, and then you do Abhyanga, it is going to cause it. So are you mimicking your body? Are you exposing your thyroid to the outside environment? So see, these things should not weigh on your mind. The whole concept of Vedic science is to cut the clutter. Make your practice that you don't require to do a Dincharya. Dincharya becomes a part of you. What it is said, you should not get up and go to the bowels. You should get bowel movement and then you get up. A very simple thing I'm telling you. If that happens in Brahma Muhurat, your digestion is absolutely great. A lot of people eat in Brahma Muhurat, 3:30. So see, these things, if you follow, the initial things, if you follow, the rest of the things follow. And then what happens, intellect or intellectual talks, you know, they put a lot of things in our mind. People will read Jwara Chikitsa, this Chikitsa, they will give a lot of Samprapti, Nidan, Doshas. It's good for the intellectual mind. But quotient of Ayurveda is not to treat diseases or not to do parallels with modern diseases. And it does tell you that by doing one thing, are you free of all your clutter? If that thing is doing, independence is happening, you're doing good. You're still going to die, but you'll be stabilized. And for that, if you want to do anything in the geographical conditions you're staying, wherever, go ahead and do it. But don't say, because I'm doing this, this is happening. Because no one can tell you how much prana you're. If you want to make a phobia that I'm doing it, stick to a particular thing, you can do it. And for me, therefore, I don't stick to any cult or any teachings. I've got a lot of teachers. I only stick to what this algorithmic knowledge is saying. And if I can replicate it in my system, whether I'm here in US, in Mumbai, or in the Himalayas, then maybe I'm doing something right.
Okay, thank you. And one more thing, what is the difference between Pran and Ojas? Sometimes we refer.
See, Ojas is the gross quantitative sattva of your body which remains, which tells you how much prana is being consumed. The more ojas you get into your system, the more ojas you get into the system, that means that your prana is being stabilized on a gross level. The moment the ojas goes down, therefore ojas also has got a quantity. There are two ojas. One is the heart, one is the brain. Agni Atmak and Somatmak. Again, as I said, Agni and Som, Ha and Tha. Got it? What I'm trying to say.
Okay. Yeah.
So these are different concepts which tells you the same thing.
Even the Tejas thing is also.
Tejas is a different thing because that Ojas, Tejas, they again go into a separate concept. So we don't have to go with concepts. Tej, Oj, different thing. Prabha, different thing. I can give you 1,000 synonyms. There's no use. So only stick with one thing. We should not worry much with these concepts of Oja, Shukra, Dhatu, this, that. You have to just say, am I stable? Am I cutting the clutter around me? Whatever practices, if it is doing, your Ojas is already growing, your Tejas is already there, everything is growing. And this is very momentary change. You can be stable in a practice and a phone call comes and you can get disturbed. Your Ojas get disturbed. So it is not something which you can say, oh no, I have achieved. Constantly these things, and therefore it is the concept of Maya is like that. It is constantly making you aware of it. The concept is not to kill this Maya, to be aware that this is happening. So the moment you know that this has happened, something has ruffled, you deal with it. You're not feeling good, but you are honest enough to accept that no, my stability has gone. You will get in, your practice will help you. We put it, no, I'm good, but this is only one stupid thing which is bothering me, then nothing is helping. So when that quotient becomes inner, and that is what is meant by all this text. But what happens, you require someone who has practiced it and then taught you. And you cannot learn it from books. Does that mean books are useless? No. You should read books. You should read it again and again. Now also, if I've told you these things, you go back and read the same book, it will appear differently. Because the text tells you the same thing. The translations might differ. So if the same shloka, if I am a practitioner, I'll translate it separately. A scholar will translate it separately. A seeker will translate it separately. A bhakta will translate it separately because he sees the same entity in different forms. So am I right and he is wrong? No, everybody is right. What you connect with is important.
Okay. Thank you.
Doctor, I wanted to ask regarding the death part. Is there anything regarding? I mean, do you consider anything regarding a bad death or a good death in terms of the prana exiting the body?
See, bad death and good death, even if you die badly or goodly, you're not going to know because you are going to transmit it if you take that quotient. But yeah, if you want to have a control, it is said that what happens when you die, how the prana goes is important. A lot of people when they die, they pass urine, they pass fecus. So they are going to go into a yoni, which is going to have a lot of suffering. Some people just die in another way, they are going to be better. The yogis therefore want to die from here. Because they say once it goes from here, there is no rebirth. Now, are these things real or not? Who knows? But if you align with the practice, if you say, no, I'm doing yoga, then your focus must be to go away from here. If you can do that, it is fine. So that is what I can tell people. It is not that we have to believe this happens or not. But if you believe that this is the only life, what you have got to lose? If you believe there is a life after this, you have to work hard. Eventually, that is what the quotient of Vedas say, that where your awareness lies and what you can do to reach there. No one can take you there. Because if you lie in your own comforts, no practices will take you there. So if I say that, okay, I'm doing so many practices, but I know if I have to die, it has to go out from here. Then I'll do every possible thing to ensure it happens. But if I say it doesn't matter, I'm doing practice just because I feel good, then why should it matter to me how I die? So this quotient everyone in their spiritual life someday should think about. And that can only come if you align with the algorithmic concept. You do Ayurveda, you do yoga, you do whatever it is.
Thanks a lot, Doctor.
Okay. Are there any other questions or inquiries before we wrap up for the afternoon, at least in New York City?
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Shweta. We'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. So there is part 2 tomorrow, same time, tomorrow at Sunday, 1 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to try to, Dr. Sumit shares so much in a very concentrated and deep, intense manner. So things might percolate, you know, into tomorrow. So bring your inquiries or questions. Just like people reread books or things, I'm going to try to send the recording out in a little bit. So if you do want to listen to it again, if that's something you want to do, or you just allow whatever's been shared today to just kind of percolate, more things may come up for tomorrow's session. So bring anything you want to explore or ask for tomorrow's session. If you haven't already donated, kindly donate to Dr. Sumit's Milk Gizzard Whiskey Fund at the PayPal link in the chat box. And, you know, this is, it's any amount. So, you know, anything is helpful. So, and then we have other upcoming programs next week. Next Tuesday is the Tantra, what is it not, what it is. Some of the questions came up today because, as Alex, you had alluded to, there's a lot of different concepts of what Tantra is. So going deeper into that. And on Thursday, we kind of close with an open Q&A session and another open forum. So feel free to share it with others in your community and other seekers. So we can keep expanding. Great. All right, well, have a good day. Thank you, Dr. Sumit, again, for sharing generously.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Sumit.
Everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Shweta ji.
Thank you.
Thank you.